Carthage, Illinois, June 27, 1844. An armed mob storms the jail and kills Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. He's 38 years old. Within months, his followers are fleeing west to Utah under new leadership. But what if those shots never fired? What if Smith had lived another 30 or 40 years? The Mormon Church you know today, with its billions, its political power, its controversies, might not exist at all. Welcome back to What If Remix. Today we're diving into one of American history's most fascinating what-ifs, and probably the most controversial video we've ever made. Joseph Smith founded a religion that now has over 17 million members worldwide and controls an estimated $236 billion in assets. But he led his church for only 14 years before he was murdered. In those 14 years, he introduced polygamy, ran for president, created his own militia, and made enemies everywhere he went. So what happens if he survives that day in Carthage and keeps leading for another 3 decades? Would the Mormon Church be more progressive today or more extreme? Let's find out. Here's what most people don't know. Joseph Smith never planned to go to Utah. That was Brigham Young's decision after Smith's death. Smith had actually been eyeing Texas, or possibly even Mexico, somewhere he could establish a semi-independent Mormon state with himself as both prophet and political leader. In 1844, just before his death, Smith had already sent scouting parties west, but he was also negotiating with the Republic of Texas. He was thinking bigger than just escaping persecution. He wanted a Mormon empire where the church controlled the government completely. If Smith lives, the Mormons might never end up in Utah at all. Maybe they end up in Texas or California before the gold rush, or even in the Oregon Territory. The entire geography of Mormonism changes, which means the culture changes too. But here's the darker possibility. Maybe Smith does go to Utah, but with him alive and in charge, the violence against the Native Americans gets worse, not better. Smith had increasingly apocalyptic visions by 1844. He was building an army. The Nauvoo Legion had 5,000 men, rivaling the U.S. Army in size. He was talking about establishing the kingdom of God on earth by force if necessary. The Mountain Meadows Massacre of 1857, where Mormons slaughtered 120 California-bound emigrants, happened under Brigham Young's leadership. But Young was trying to create a defensive Mormon homeland. Smith, with his more grandiose vision, might have been even more aggressive. Or maybe, just maybe, his direct presence would have prevented the massacre entirely, since he would have had absolute authority to stop it. We'll never know. But one thing's certain. Wherever the Mormons ended up with Smith alive, it would have looked very different than what we got. Now let's talk about what got Joseph Smith killed in the first place: polygamy. By 1844, Smith had somewhere between 30 and 40 wives, some as young as 14. He'd been secretly practicing and teaching plural marriage since the 1830s, but by the 1840s it was becoming impossible to hide. The scandal was destroying his movement from within. His own wife, Emma, hated it. Many of his closest followers were disgusted. The broader American public was horrified. Polygamy was seen as barbaric, un-American, proof that Mormonism was a dangerous cult. Here's the controversial question. If Smith lives, does he double down on polygamy or abandon it? Under Brigham Young, the church openly embraced plural marriage for decades until the U.S. government forced them to stop in 1890. But that was Young's choice. Smith was more pragmatic, more politically ambitious. He was running for president of the United States in 1844. You can't be president and a polygamist, not in 19th century America. My guess? Smith publicly renounces polygamy by 1850 to make Mormonism more acceptable to mainstream America. But here's the thing. He'd probably keep practicing it privately. That was his pattern. Public denial, private practice, and claiming revelation when convenient. If that happens, the Mormon Church becomes respectable decades earlier. No federal raids, no seizing of church property, no Utah having to renounce polygamy to become a state. But it also means thousands of Mormon men don't take multiple wives. Entire families that existed in our timeline are never born. the genetic and social structure of Mormon Utah completely changes. And here's the really uncomfortable part. Some fundamentalist Mormon groups still practice polygamy today, claiming they're following Joseph Smith's original teachings. If Smith had lived and officially rejected polygamy, would these groups even exist? Or would they be worse, claiming that Brigham Young corrupted Smith's true vision? Let's talk about one of the most painful chapters in Mormon history, the priesthood ban on black men. From 1852 until 1978, the Mormon Church taught that men of African descent couldn't hold the priesthood, basically excluding them from full participation in the religion. Here's what's crucial. That ban was instituted by Brigham Young in 1852, 8 years after Joseph Smith's death. Smith's own position on race was complicated and evolved over time. In the early days, Smith actually ordained black men to the priesthood. A man named Elijah Abel received the priesthood in 1836 and served as a missionary. There were others. Smith seemed relatively progressive on race for his time. And remember, we're talking about the 1830s and 1840s here. By the 1840s, Smith's views were shifting. He opposed abolition, supported gradual emancipation, and made statements suggesting he saw black people as cursed descendants of Cain. It's messy and contradictory, like most things about Smith. So if he lives, does the priesthood ban happen at all? Maybe, maybe not. Or maybe it happens but gets reversed much sooner, perhaps by the 1870s or 1880s instead of 1978. If black men receive the priesthood under Smith's leadership, or if the ban never happens, Mormonism looks radically different today. The church might have a significant black membership instead of being overwhelmingly white. The painful history and the theological gymnastics required to explain why a loving God would exclude people based on race, all of that potentially doesn't happen. But here's the uncomfortable counterpoint. Smith was a product of his time. By the 1850s and 1860s, as America lurches towards civil war, Smith might have hardened his racial views like so many others did. Maybe the priesthood ban happens anyway, just under his direct authority instead of Young's. And if Smith institutes it instead of Young, it might have been even harder to reverse because it would have come directly from the founding prophet. Here's something that should terrify and fascinate you. Joseph Smith was running for President of the United States when he was killed. He had a political platform: abolish slavery gradually, reduce Congress's power, expand presidential authority, and make prison reform a priority. But Smith didn't just want to be president. He wanted to establish the kingdom of God on earth with himself as both prophet and king. In 1844, he created the Council of 50, a secret organization designed to be the governing body of this kingdom. He was crowned king, priest, and ruler over Israel on earth. Now imagine Smith lives. Maybe he doesn't win the presidency in 1844. He was polling badly and had almost no chance. But what about 1848? 1852? If the Mormons establish a powerful base in Texas or California or Utah, and if Smith moderates his more extreme positions to seem more mainstream, could he actually build enough political power to be a serious candidate? Here's the really wild scenario. Smith becomes a territorial governor, maybe of Utah or California. He controls thousands of loyal followers who vote as a bloc. By the 1850s, he's wielding serious political power in Washington. The Mormon Church becomes not just a religion, but a genuine political force decades earlier than it actually did. The wealth accumulation that makes today's Mormon Church worth over $200 billion, that might happen even faster with Smith's business savvy and political connections. Or it might not happen at all if Smith's more radical tendencies keep making enemies who try to destroy the church economically. But here's what I think happens. Smith's ambition eventually destroys him. Either he pushes too hard and provokes another violent confrontation, maybe with the U.S. government itself, or his own followers eventually turn on him as his demands become more extreme and his behavior more erratic. One of the wildest things about Joseph Smith was that he never stopped adding new revelations. Every few years, he'd announce some new doctrine that radically changed Mormon theology. Baptism for the dead, multiple levels of heaven, the idea that humans can become gods themselves, temple ceremonies, secret names. It was constantly evolving. He'd only been doing this for 14 years when he died. What would another 30 years of revelations have produced? Maybe by the 1860s, Smith announces that Jesus will return in 1870, leading to a massive crisis when it doesn't happen. Maybe he introduces even more controversial practices beyond polygamy. Maybe he completely reorganizes church structure and authority. Here's the fascinating part. The Mormon Church today is relatively stable and mainstream compared to its early years. But that stability came partly because Brigham Young, while controversial, eventually stopped introducing radical new doctrines. Young focused on survival and building Zion in Utah. Smith wouldn't have stopped. His personality, his revelatory pattern, his ambition, it all suggests he would have kept pushing boundaries, kept claiming new visions, kept changing everything. By the 1870s, would Mormonism even be recognizable compared to what Smith founded in 1830? And here's the question that keeps me up at night. Would that have been better or worse? More revelations might have meant more adaptation to changing times. Or it might have made the church so extreme that it collapsed entirely or splintered into dozens of competing factions. So let's bring it to the present day, and we're imagining a timeline where Joseph Smith lived until maybe 1880 or so, dying at 75 instead of 38. Would the modern Mormon Church still have $236 billion in assets? Maybe more, maybe less. Depends entirely on where they ended up geographically and whether Smith's political ambitions paid off or backfired. Would they still oppose same-sex marriage and maintain conservative political stances? Hard to say. Smith was pragmatic enough to change positions when necessary. But he was also authoritarian enough to double down on unpopular stances if he thought God commanded it. Would there be fewer or more splinter groups? Probably more. Smith's continuing revelations would have created more fracture points. Today, we might have a dozen major Mormon denominations instead of just a handful. Would men of color have received the priesthood sooner? Quite possibly, yes. That might be the most positive change in this alternate timeline. Decades or even a century of racial progress that didn't happen in our reality. What if Joseph Smith lived? The honest answer is probably not better, maybe worse. Smith was brilliant, charismatic, visionary, and deeply flawed. His ambitions were boundless, and his judgment was often terrible. He created something extraordinary, but he also left chaos in his wake. Maybe Brigham Young's more conservative, survival-focused leadership, however problematic, was actually what allowed Mormonism to survive into the modern era. Maybe if Smith had lived, his escalating ambitions would have provoked the U.S. government into crushing the movement entirely. Or maybe Smith would have moderated, evolved, and built something even more impressive. Maybe the Mormon Church today would be more progressive, more racially diverse, more politically powerful. We'll never know. Those shots in Carthage killed not just a man, but an entire alternate future. What do you think? Would the Mormon Church be better or worse if Joseph Smith had lived? Let me know in the comments, and be respectful. This is a sensitive topic for millions of believers.